Plants vs. Zombies has seen its cast of plants change drastically after 16 years of new games and updates. Some plants have had a massive rise to power, while others have had tragic downfalls. In this series, we go over those specific plants that have had the biggest transformations over the years. Today, we'll be looking at Gatling Pea. Gatling Pea started out as one of the heaviest hitters in the original Plants vs. Zombies. It then suffered a lengthy absence before returning years later with a shocking rework that surpassed everyone's expectations. But how and why has Gatling Pea been changed so drastically? Let's rewind back to the beginning and find out. This is the complete history of Gatling Pea in Plants vs. Zombies. Gatling Pea first sprouted in George Fan's concept sketches for the first Plants vs. Zombies. Sketches were made of this character donning ammunition, a gun of some kind, and the iconic face paint under the frowning eyes that we now know from Gatling Pea. I don't know what kind of plant this is supposed to be, but I think it's fair to assume that this is where those aforementioned Gatling Pea design elements originated from. Gatling Pea would far more closely resemble the character we know and love today in one of the early prototypes of the game, looking essentially identical apart from some different coloring. With the final release of the game in May 2009, Gatling Pea would make his debut, along with the franchise itself. Gatling Pea was introduced as a 250 sun upgrade plant to repeater that shoots 4 peas at a time. In case you haven't played the first game, upgrade plants are plants that you place on top of other plants to upgrade them. So for 250 sun, you could upgrade a repeater from shooting 2 peas at a time to 4 peas, doubling its DPS. So essentially Gatling Pea cost 450 sun total. Gatling Pea also had a very slow recharge, so it took quite a while to build up multiple of them. It was cheaper to play 2 repeaters or 1 repeater and 1 torchwood to simulate a Gatling Pea, but Gatling Pea's premium allowed you to save a tile compared to those other strategies. On the topic of torchwood, torchwood is a plant that doubled the power of pea-based plants, and gave them some splash damage. So naturally, the more peas a plant shoots, the more value you would get out of Torchwood. This made Gatling Pea and Torchwood specifically an insane combo, matching the DPS of 8 Peashooters plus splash damage. Each additional Gatling Pea would multiply this amount. This crazy amount of damage and value made Torchwood Gatling Pea's main synergy. So now that we have a rundown of how Gatling Pea functioned, just how viable was it in all the game's modes? In the adventure mode, Gatling Pea was very strong. Its only true counters were the Snorkel Zombie, Balloon Zombie, and Digger Zombie, but these could all easily be remedied by bringing their respective lock and key plant counterparts. Even armored zombies like Bucketheads and Screen Doors, which are usually a problem for pea shooting plants, can be shredded by Gatling Pea. However, there were a few things that held Gatling Pea back from being a mainstay here. Most obviously, you didn't get to use it much at all in the first place throughout the adventure. It was only made available after beating level 3-4. Combine this with the fact that it was basically unusable in the roost stage due to the roost slant, and you could only realistically use it in the second half of the pool levels and all the fog levels. So only like a quarter of the adventure. And even then, due to the limited sun in the fog stage, you wouldn't be able to use a lot of them there either. On top of all of this, Gatling Pea's very slow recharge time meant that at most you could only get a few of them down per level. However, in the survival modes, this obviously wasn't a problem since you could carry over your plant setup between levels. This meant that you could build up large amounts of Gatling Peas despite their recharge. Gatling Pea was strong in all of the survival modes, but it was especially dominant in survival day since none of its counters that I mentioned earlier could even show up. So a Gatling Pea Torchwood setup is basically a guaranteed win. Gatling Pea, along with every other upgrade plant, is unfortunately not available in any of the Versus modes. However, it did make a cameo in the DS version of the game in 2011, starring in the DS exclusive Air Raid minigame, being one of the 2 plants that can pilot the Flower Pot airplane. The other was 3-peater, which is actually an upgrade to Gatling Pea in this minigame. Overall, Gatling Pea was the ultimate pea shooting plant in the original Plants vs. Zombies. Although you didn't get to use it much in the adventure mode, it was very powerful when and where you could use it. In the survival modes where you could use it to its full potential, it was even more powerful. Being a straight shooting plant, it did have its limitations, but overall, it was one of the strongest damage dealers in the game. Plants vs. Zombies 2 released in July of 2013 and surprisingly didn't include Gatling Pea despite every single other pea shooter from the first game returning. Gatling Pea was the only one left behind. Now there are a few reasons that could have gone into this decision. First off, Plants vs. Zombies 2 got rid of the upgrade plants feature. However, this didn't stop 3 other upgrade plants from returning as normal plants in this game. Twin Sunflower, Spike Rock, and Wintermelon, all at launch. So that in itself can't explain why PopCap decided to leave Gatling Pea behind. Another possible reason is because a new Peashooter plant, Peapod, kind of fills the same role. A Peapod that's 4/5 full functions identically to a Gatling Pea, shooting 4 peas at a time. A full Peapod does even better, shooting 5 peas. A 4/5 filled Peapod also costs a similar amount, a cumulative 500 sun compared to Gatling Pea's 450 sun. So maybe PopCap thought Gatling Pea would be pointless when Peapod fills its role as shooting many peas at a premium to be condensed in one tile. Peapod is also kind of a spiritual successor of upgrade plants since it works in a similar way where you place a plant on top of an existing one, except here you can only place Peapods on other Peapods. The last reason I can think of Gatling Pea being excluded from the sequel is because of Peashooter's plant food ability. Well, not the ability itself, but how it looks. While doing its plant food ability, Peashooter transforms to look extremely similar to Gatling Pea with the helmet and all. The same is true for Repeater's plant food ability, so these could kind of be considered Gatling Pea's cameos in this game. Funnily enough, this situation is identical to Doom Shrooms if you remember back to the last plant history video, just to replace Peashooter and Repeater with Boom Balloon Flower. If you haven't watched Doom Shrooms history video, then you should definitely go do that after watching this one. Anyway, back to Gatling Pea. While I wasn't fortunate enough to properly return to the second game, it wouldn't take long for its next appearance in the franchise. February of 2014 brought with it Plants vs Zombies Garden Warfare, a sudden shift to the third-person shooter genre. And given Gatling Pea's combat-inspired aesthetics, it would be a missed opportunity to exclude it from this game. While it didn't feature as a playable character class, well, there's an exception, but we'll get to that soon. It was instead included as a spawnable potted plant for the Garden Ops, Gardens and Graveyards, and Taco Bandits modes. Gatling Pea works a bit differently here compared to the original Plants vs Zombies. Instead of being a directly better version of other pea shooters, it works very differently to the potted pea cannon and pea repeater in this game. While the pea cannon and pea repeater slowly shoot individual big peas that do high damage, Gatling Pea rapidly shoots small peas that do little damage. However, due to how quickly Gatling Pea fires them, it ends up doing more damage than the others anyway. As such, it can basically be considered an upgrade to the other pea potted plants regardless. As for how viable it was as a potted plant, Gatling Pea was considered a strong potted plant, potentially one of the best due to its high damage output. In Garden Ops, it could struggle a little bit in waves with lots of zombies since unlike Pea Cannon and Pea Repeater, it didn't have splash damage. But this didn't stop it from outshining them anyway. As a funny consequence of it not returning in Plants vs Zombies 2, its icon uses its Plants vs Zombies 1 art, while Pea Cannon and Pea Repeater use Plants vs Zombies 2 art. On top of Gatling Pea featuring as a potted plant, it also cameoed as a playable ability for the Peashooter class. This is the exception of the Gatling Pea not being playable in this game that I alluded to earlier. This is a lot like its cameo in Plants vs Zombies 2, as both these cameos involve Peashooter temporarily transforming into Gatling Pea while using a special ability. The ability in question is Pea Gatling. When used, you would root into the ground, unable to move, and your attack would switch to small pea pellets fired at a rapid rate. The difference between Peashooter's attack in and out of Gatling Pea is very similar to the difference between the potted pea cannon and Gatling Pea's attacks respectively. You gained a higher DPS, faster fire rate, and better accuracy at the cost of splash damage. But in the case of the Pea Gatling ability, your DPS would increase at an extreme rate. The Pea Gatling ability's DPS was insanely high and you could melt zombies in a matter of seconds. Also, if you used it in a bad spot, so long as you didn't fire any peas, you could unroot and get the ability back instantly instead of waiting 45 seconds for it to recharge. The only thing that stopped this ability from being absolutely broken was the fact that you became a ZPG magnet when you used it, a sitting duck essentially since you couldn't move. With lots of foot soldiers, especially Super Commando, being rife in this game, this was a pretty big problem. To make up for this, you were given 20% damage resistance in the ability, but this still wasn't enough to stop you dying in one shot from a ZPG. But all this is less of a problem in Garden Ops. In Garden Ops, Pea Gatling was arguably even stronger than it was in multiplayer, as you could absolutely melt bosses with its insane damage output. Regardless of its flaws, Pea Gatling was definitely one of the better abilities in the game. Pea Gatling also had an alternate ability that you could switch it with called Retro Gatling, which was added in the Garden Variety DLC update in March 2014, less than a month after the game's release. It could be unlocked from opening sticker packs. Retro Gatling was more accurate and dealt more damage per hit, but had only half as much ammo and fired slower. Overall, Pea Gatling has a higher DPS, and as such, most players just stick with regular Pea Gatling. So all things considered, Gatling Pea's cameos in the first shooter were pretty good. In February of 2016, Gatling Pea would return for Garden Warfare 2. In its potted plant form, it remains completely unchanged from the first Garden Warfare, but the same can't be said about the Pea Gatling ability for the Peashooter class, which received an ungodly amount of buffs. The ability's damage resistance was doubled to 40%, and its damage was buffed from 8 and 10 for a crit to 10 and 12 for a crit. And if you thought PopCap had the mercy to stop there, they didn't. Its cooldown was decreased from 45 seconds to 30 seconds, so you could use the already buffed ability more often. Keep in mind that this was already a great ability in the first Garden Warfare, so why they decided to buff it so much in Garden Warfare 2, I have no idea. The Peashooter class is already really overpowered in Garden Warfare 2, so these buffs only made it even more so. And for the Pea Gatling ability itself, it went from a great ability to one of the best in the game. Pea Gatling's DPS is about 150 and its crit DPS is about 175, so it can laser down most zombies in less than a second. It's also notorious for being the single best counter to Z-mechs in the entire game, since it can laser them down in only a couple of seconds. As a zombie, most of the time when you die to Pea Gatling, you die before you even know what was hitting you. In June 2018, a reskinned version of Retro Gatling called Bling Gatling was added to the game. Both were identical functionally, and as such, both were still worse than the regular Pea Gatling. Overall, while the Gatling Pea itself remained unchanged in Garden Warfare 2, the Pea Gatling ability was buffed beyond belief and became one of the most feared abilities in the game. While Gatling Pea was absent from Plants vs Zombies Heroes in its October 2016 launch, it found its way into the game in the Colossal Fossils update in October 2017. It was a 4/5 legendary 5 sunk cost pea plant in the Mega Grow class with Double Strike. However, it wouldn't stay in this state for long, since a few months later in January 2018, it would be changed to be 5/4 instead of 4/5. It also had the evolution trait that was also introduced in the Colossal Fossils update, Pea Evolution to be specific. This meant that, much like the original Plants vs Zombies actually, you could plant it on top of an existing plant. But here, as the evolution gimmick, it worked very differently. Being a pea evolution plant, you could plant it on top of any pea plant, so not just repeater. Also, you didn't even have to use the evolution gimmick, you could just plant it on its own. But that's not suggested because you're not really getting as much value out of the plant. When you evolve a pea plant with it, the reward for doing so was that Gatling Pea would do a bonus attack. Due to its high damage output, Gatling Pea became one of the best cards in the Mega Grow class. It was great for both removing zombies from the field and dealing a lethal amount of damage directly to the zombie hero. A double strike with 5 damage could literally wipe half of your opponent's hero's health in a single turn, and the bonus attack it did from evolving could get rid of any zombies in the way before doing so. If your opponent's hero had 10 health or less, you could just straight up win if you play this thing right. And the fact that you had to synergize it with pea plants didn't hold it back at all, because pea plants such as Click Peas and Black Eyed Pea were some of the strongest in the game, just as strong if not stronger than Gatling Pea itself. Gatling Pea was a very powerful plant in Plants vs Zombies Heroes, with a gimmick that made reference to how it worked in the original Plants vs Zombies. So was this a sign that Gatling Pea could make its grand return to the mainline tower defense games? No. Well, not just yet. In September 2019, Gatling Pea would return yet again to the shooter series. This time in Plants vs Zombies Battle for Neighbourville in both its potted plant and ability forms. The potted Gatling Pea remained unchanged from Garden Warfare 2, however the Pea Gatling ability would face a pretty big nerf. Perhaps PopCap realized they went way overboard with those buffs in Garden Warfare 2. The ability's damage resistance was reduced from 40% all the way to 0%. It was completely removed. Now, while in Pea Gatling, you would just take as much damage as you normally would. This obviously hurt the ability since you're a sitting duck and an easy target for all the zombies to shoot at. I believe this is why they gave the ability damage resistance in the first place, so the fact that they removed it was quite a drastic and surprising nerf. But it turns out that's exactly what the ability needed to be balanced. It went from being among the best abilities in Garden Warfare 2 and one of the most frustrating to go against to just being a solid, well-rounded ability in Battle for Neighbourville. Plus, it wasn't all bad for the ability in this game. They also reworked the cooldown so that if you en route for the ability, the cooldown would be based on how much ammo you used instead of always being around 30 seconds. Overall, Pea Gatling was a solid ability here, a few notches down from the absolute powerhouse that it was in Garden Warfare 2. And Gatling Pea itself in its potted plant form still remains the same since Garden Warfare 1. At this point, it had been over a decade since Gatling Pea featured in the mainline tower defense Plants vs Zombies. Although it had had a range of very successful and powerful appearances in the spin-off games, its last tower defense appearance was all the way back in the first game in 2009. However, this would all change in a few years' time. Finally, after 13 years of spin-off appearances, Gatling Pea returned to mainline Plants vs Zombies in an update to Plants vs Zombies 2 in July 2022. As a new CDM called Mega Gatling Pea. Here's a fun fact for you. I originally made my channel with the intention of doing Garden Warfare 2 content, but around the time Mega Gatling Pea came out, I decided to mostly focus on Plants vs Zombies 2, and well, the rest is history. Part of the reason I got back into Plants vs Zombies 2 after like 4 years away from it was because I wanted to get Mega Gatling Pea. PopCap's nostalgia bait worked on me. So yeah, thanks Mega Gatling Pea for being part of the reason why my channel is where it is today. Channel lore aside, why did it return as a revamped Mega Gatling Pea instead of just Gatling Pea? Well, Gatling Pea couldn't just return to Plants vs Zombies 2 after all these years. As with many other plants we've covered in this series, Gatling Pea needed to be changed in order to fit into the new environment of modern Plants vs Zombies 2. With Arena, Penny's Pursuit, and broken modern CDMs to compete with, the very powerful Gatling Pea of 2009 would have been considered very mid by 2022 power creep standards. And so PopCap decided to reintroduce Gatling Pea as Mega Gatling Pea with a new coat of paint and a new set of abilities. Mega Gatling Pea was a 400 Suncost CDM plant with a 5-second recharge that shoots peas in lots of 4. But it was no longer an upgrade plant, instead being a standalone plant like all the other former upgrade plants since, like I mentioned, that mechanic wasn't brought to the second game. So far, it sounds pretty similar to Gatling Pea, just a little cheaper and easier to plant. However, this is where things get interesting. Mega Gatling Pea had the unique ability to spontaneously plant food itself. Its plant food ability shot a load of peas, pretty par for the course for a Peashooter plant. But its plant food ability also made it permanently shoot 5 peas at a time instead of just 4. This was a great plant food ability, and the fact that it could spontaneously activate it by itself was very unique and very powerful. The chance for it to do this was 2% every time it attacked. On top of everything I've mentioned, its peas also travel 4 times faster than other Peashooters. All of these added features made it blow every other Peashooter out of the water, yet it was only priced as if it was a 4P Peashooter. Needless to say, this plant was incredibly powerful. Mega Gatling Pea could annihilate adventure mode levels, and it wasn't even close. This isn't too surprising considering it was designed around modern Plants vs Zombies 2, with Arena and Penny's Pursuit and such, while the adventure mode was a relic of classic Plants vs Zombies 2 before the power creep. The adventure mode wasn't designed with plants like Mega Gatling Pea in mind, and it showed. The only world where Mega Gatling Pea wasn't as useful was Dark Ages, since the limited sun made it harder to afford, and for all its power, Mega Gatling Pea was still just as vulnerable to jesters as any other Peashooter. The only other zombies in the entire game that Mega Gatling Pea couldn't handle were the Excavator and Snorkelers when underwater. In the Arena and Penny's Pursuit modes, Gatling Pea was a force to be reckoned with, possibly even the best plant in these modes, particularly when combined with Torchwood, Pea Vine, and Appeasement. This combination actually made Mega Gatling Pea the highest DPS plant in the entire game. Torchwood and Peavine would increase its damage, and importantly, appeasement would way increase its chance to plant food itself while the appeasement was active. So whenever you'd use appeasement with Mega Gatling Pea, your screen would just get covered with peas and there'd be just plant foods everywhere. So long as there were no dragon imps, excavators, or jesters, this strategy was one of, if not the most optimal in the game. In Arena and Penny's Pursuit, the zombies' health was often increased far beyond their base levels, but Mega Gatling Pea's insane damage output, when combined with these other plants, made a mockery of this. To this day, Mega Gatling Pea remains arguably the best plant in Plants vs Zombies 2 in terms of raw power. PopCap treated Gatling Pea very well with this redesign, but this isn't actually where Gatling Pea's story ends. In October of 2025, PopCap hosted a soft launch of Plants vs Zombies 3 Evolved, which featured the most recent iteration of Gatling Pea. This one was quite strange. It had the visual appearance of Mega Gatling Pea, but functionally had come full circle and was back to how it worked in 2009. It just shot 4 peas at a time. You could plant Mega Gatling Pea by merging 2 repeaters, which themselves were obtained by merging 2 Peashooters each. So basically, it had the cost of 4 Peashooters for a cumulative sunk cost of 400. That's the same cost as Mega Gatling Pea, so it had the cost and visuals of Mega Gatling Pea and the attack and name of Gatling Pea. Interestingly, it was the only version of Gatling Pea that didn't have the Gatling guns that gave it the name Gatling Pea. Mega Gatling Pea had them, but only showed them when attacking. But as we're all too used to at this stage, this version of Plants vs Zombies 3 didn't last long. With its closure in November 2025, Gatling Pea's history came to an end. For now. Ever since Gatling Pea's introduction in 2009, it's been a dominant, highly powerful damage dealer. From its appearances in the shooters as both an ability and a spawnable potted plant, to its appearance in Plants vs Zombies Heroes, to its drastic rework in Plants vs Zombies 2, Gatling Pea has changed a lot throughout the years. But one thing has always stayed consistent: he's always been a force to be reckoned with. Thank you all for watching, and let me know in the comments which plant you want me to cover next. See you next time.